Okay, so good morning and thank you for joining me on what is our seminar with regards to mental health in an unequal world. And more importantly, what does that mean for employers? Many of you will be aware that yesterday was indeed World Mental Health Day, and the theme was about inequality, recognizing that the world in which we live, the amount of money that's invested in mental health services is disproportionate to investment in all other health and well-being. On average, typically around the world, it represents about a 2% of the total health budget invested in mental health services. So what does that mean for us in our world today? And this morning, what does that mean for employers? That's the question that we're going to be particularly looking at. So, with all that said and done, what actually is the current context? Well, here in the UK, we know that over the last 12 months, the number of people diagnosed with depression has doubled. And referral into mental health services has also doubled in certain areas. What that means is an additional 300,000 people have been referred into a system that was already overstretched. Statistically, any number of those people could be your employees, they could be your team members. And you may be surprised to hear that typically only 4 in 10 people will get the help that they need at the time that they need it. So what does that mean for us as employers? Let's have a look a little bit more. Back in 2014, NHS England committed to parity of esteem by 2020. Now, parity of esteem is basically recognising the issue of mental health on the same footing as we do physical health. Therefore, investments were set to increase, etc., etc. And the goal for achievement of parity of esteem was 2020, which, as many of you will be aware, rather than us achieving that, 2020 actually brought even further challenges for our health service. And we now know the mental health consequences of COVID-19, and they are becoming increasingly evident. The Royal College of Psychiatrists tell us that clinicians are reporting increasing numbers in referrals for patients with COVID-related mood and anxiety disorders, including PTSD, as well as the lockdown-specific deterioration in patient care, where face-to-face services were stopped completely in some cases. And so a system that was already overstretched, underfunded, and some would say overwhelmed, has actually had even more increase in terms of the number of people that need help from it. The NHS is said to need 2 to 3 times its current capacity in order to adequately meet and treat the expected increase. And therefore, that investment is even more important today than it was back in 2014 when the parity of esteem was first discussed. So what does that mean to you? What does it mean to employers if your employees are not able to access the help they need? If they're lucky and they are one of the 4 in 10, that's great. But what if they're not? What impact might that have on your workplace? What do you need to do as an organisation to exercise your duty of care without becoming counsellors or therapists? What role should an employer be playing? And what about those extreme cases? Recently, it was reported that a man who died by suicide, the coroner's report stated clearly that work-related stress was a contributing factor, and his employer was named in that coroner's report. So what if your people are struggling? What if work-related stress is an issue for you? Given that we know the system is indeed overwhelmed, how do you best manage such scenarios? And that's really where we're going to focus our time and attention today. For those of you that I haven't met before, my name's Andrea Newton. And for the last 22 years, incredible, I am only 27 in my head. For the last 22 years, I've worked with thousands of managers across all different industry sectors, from ITV to the NHS, from construction and engineering to food manufacturing and fine wine. And I'm a woman on a mission to get people talking about the uncomfortable, to get comfortable with the uncomfortable, so that we can have really useful conversations that matter. And I'm also the host of the Really Useful Conversations podcast, where every week we explore an issue that is relevant in the workplace, where we're perhaps not having the conversations that we should be. And also how, as managers and leaders and HR professionals, we could go about having those conversations. So just a little bit of background about me, just to let you know who I am. And many of you will know that I had my own challenges rooting around at rock bottom, and my intention was indeed to end my life. That prompted me to become a tutor with the National Centre for Suicide Prevention Training. So I help organisations right across the spectrum, from team leaders newly promoted who need to be confident in their conversations, all the way through to handling issues such as poor mental health and suicide ideation from a leadership capacity. And so I'm indeed that woman on a mission to get people talking. And today I want us to consider that if indeed 4 out of 10 people are the lucky ones who get the help they need when they need it, for us as employers, as organisations, potentially what that means is an increase in absenteeism, performance dips. It creates stress for others who are having to perhaps double up and do the work of a colleague who's off sick. Customer service could be at risk. Our reputation as an organisation, as an employer. Health and safety, quite clearly, if we've got people who are still coming to work, perhaps not getting the help they need, and also feeling too embarrassed to talk about it, there's potential risks there to health and safety. So if people with a mental health disorder are not getting the help they need, the costs and risks to organisations can be significant, whether that is people who are absent, or whether that is indeed people who are doing their best to carry on with their normal routine, but perhaps not on top of their game. But it's reassuring to know that as an employer, there are definitely things that can be done to help in this situation. If anybody wants to grab some free resources around this, if you visit the confidentconversations.co.uk website, you'll find there some information about helping people to build better resilience. You'll also find information there about signposting people to professional resources. So do be aware, there's lots of free information out there right now that supports our plea to, better help for mental health. So do take a look at those if you recognise as an organisation that you could perhaps manage these situations better if you just knew how. And amongst those free resources, we do talk about the fact that as an organisation, you have a legal obligation to ensure that the workplace isn't making matters worse, or indeed causing poor mental health. Now, most of my clients are aware that you are obliged to conduct a risk assessment around mental health in the way you might conduct a risk assessment around physical health in the workplace. However, sadly, we know that lots of organisations don't do these risk assessments around mental health in that same way. And it is important that we're doing that, because an ounce of prevention is always better than a pound of cure. People today are doing jobs that on a day-to-day basis may well be stressful, may well bring them into contact with people who are struggling. For example, last week I did some work with a local council where a team of individuals who were responsible for collecting debt around council tax. At the moment, they are having some quite distressing conversations with people who are struggling financially. So as an organisation, have you given your people the training that they need to handle matters like that, if that's relevant to them? A housing association that I also work with has helped with their tradespeople, people who are going into tenants' houses, because again, they are potentially being faced on a day-to-day basis with challenging situations that can in turn impact on that employee's mental health and well-being. So we really do need to look at being protective, what we can do to prevent, and making sure that if an individual does have an existing mental health condition, that the organisation is not adding to, making that worse, or even making that load heavier to carry. And the HSE tell us that actually, as organisations, sadly, we are still not where we need to be. In 2020, it was estimated that as many as 828,000 workers were affected by work-related stress, depression, or anxiety. And for us as a UK economy, that equates to almost 18 million working days lost. It doesn't take a genius to work out that that is fairly significant and very costly. Interestingly, those absences were more prevalent in certain industries, and we've known for some time that certain industries and certain job roles are also at greater risk of poor mental health and indeed suicide ideation. So if you are in one of those organisations, I would urge you even more so to really look at what you're doing right now to prevent, protect and support mental health. The main factors that were cited were to do with pressure of work, including tight deadlines, too much responsibility, and a lack of managerial support, which in some ways we can't really blame our managers for if they're not trained and equipped and aware of what they should be doing. So organisations absolutely have an obligation there too. The HSE talk about 6 specific factors that organisations should be looking at in order to take better care of mental health in the workplace. They include looking at the demands of the job. So, for example, the team that I mentioned who are collecting council tax debt, that job is very demanding right now, with people being very challenged and very distressed. The amount of control that people have over the way they do the job and the job that they do. How much support does that person receive? Do they feel well supported within the workplace, or do they feel a little bit isolated? I know with situations where organisations have had people working remotely or even furloughed, people have said that they didn't feel supported and they felt that the relationships weren't there so they were left feeling isolated, lonely. Somebody even used the phrase furloughed and forgotten. So relationships really do matter within the community of your organisation. The HSE also tell us that we need to look at the specific job role that people are doing and take a look and see if that role is likely to be a risk factor for mental health. So perhaps people who work alone, people who work away from home, people who work in areas where the work is very challenging day to day. People who perhaps work with short notice, tight deadlines, people who are perhaps on 0 hours contracts and never really know from one day to the next what work they're going to be doing. There's all sorts of factors that we know can impact on someone's well-being. And finally, the amount of change that the organisation is going through and how well that change is being managed. And I think it's fair to say the last 18 months have been nothing but change for many of us. So how well have we handled that? How well have we supported people? How well are we bringing people back to the workplace if indeed they have been furloughed or working from home? And again, on the Really Useful Conversations podcast, there is an episode that talks specifically about returning to work post-COVID. So please do have a little look and listen into that. We know that the single biggest influence on organisational climate is leadership. And as an organisation, if we have good leadership with managers and leaders who are educated, aware, who are confident to have conversations that matter, who are comfortable in their role in terms of supporting their team, that is the single biggest influence on organisational climate, which, by the way, simply means how it feels to work here. So we really need to start with that and make sure that we've got those good foundations in place if we do want to take better care of mental health within our organisations. And we need to have managers who are able to have conversations that matter, whether those conversations are simply coaching conversations, helping somebody perhaps develop skill and confidence, whether those conversations are challenging conversations where we need to talk about difficult stuff, awkward stuff, whether those conversations are return to work interviews where we're having to perhaps talk about sensitive issues with people. I know a lot of the managers that I work with, they would rather chew off their own arm than have a conversation about somebody's mental health if they're returning from a period of sickness absence, for example. And equally, do we have managers that are able to spot the signs and therefore intervene with an appropriate conversation where relevant? Those 7 significant conversations should be something that every leader, every manager, every HR professional is capable and confident to have, because those are the framework for creating that culture that people do enjoy being part of, where people do feel they belong, where people do feel supported, encouraged, and valued. And talking of which, we do need to make sure that when we are considering our unequal world, we also recognise the impact that discrimination can have. Now, you'll be aware that discrimination is defined as differential and unjust treatment of individuals, specific protected characteristics that you'll be familiar with. You may not be aware of the effect of such discrimination on mental health and suicide ideation, but there is tons of research out there that demonstrates that to us. For example, just simply to be aware that as a young Black male, you are twice as likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act as your white counterparts. And just have a look at those people and their treatment in society, and we can see lots of research and lots of evidence that supports the fact that discrimination, whether that's attitude, language, ignorance, or behaviour, how they all contribute negatively to the climate, the culture of our organisations. And it would be nice to think that we are living in a world where good progress is being made. But actually in 2020, the official figures show an 8% increase in hate crime. Offences that were motivated by sexual orientation increased by 19%, and so on. There are lots of sad statistics that reconfirm the inequalities of the world in which we currently live, including the fact that employment tribunals saw a 48% rise in race discrimination claims. Now, some of you will be aware there could be other factors that contribute towards that rise in terms of the way the system has recently changed, but also because people are now more prepared to speak out. People are prepared to speak up if they don't feel that they're being treated fairly. And even situations such as women dealing with the menopause has been cited over the last 3 years. The number of employment tribunal cases related to the menopause, let me just get my words out, has actually trebled. And again, that could be a combination that women are getting bolder and speaking out more about it. Or again, it could be an indication that organisations are simply not educated, simply not aware of the impact that something like menopause can have. By the way, menopause can also increase the risk of depression, anxiety, and thoughts of suicide for women who are dealing with the more extreme symptoms. So again, as an organisation, please do bear in mind that when we talk about protected characteristics, we're not just talking about the 9 that you're all familiar with. We're also talking about specific issues such as how do we support women through that life transition. So lots to think about in terms of our unequal world, but actually the overall summary from Kronos is that we are seeing a substantial number of discrimination claims being brought, which shows that employers are still failing to completely follow the legal obligations. And therefore, understanding how discriminatory practice or unfair treatment can contribute towards poor mental health and the unequal world that we're referencing here today. As an organisation, you've probably done some training around diversity, inclusivity, equality of opportunity. You've probably talked to your managers and leaders about the importance of treating people fairly, regardless of race, age, gender, sexuality, etc., etc. Have you also spoken to them and included how to make sure that people who are perhaps struggling with their mental health need to be supported? Have you also spoken to them about how women going through the menopause may need additional support and even reasonable adjustments right now? Or has your diversity, inclusivity and equality of opportunity training simply been the tick box exercise that so many organisations seem to do? If we are serious about creating a culture where well-being is supported and where honest, open, frank dialogue can happen, we do need to make sure that it isn't just a tick box exercise. We absolutely need to make sure that as an organisation, this is part and parcel of the way we do things around here, that it's part of the fabric and fibre of our everyday people management activities. And recognizing that signing up to the latest well-being initiative, Free Fruit Friday, Wellness Wednesday, yoga in the canteen with Louise from accounts, all of those initiatives may indeed be well intended. But let's be honest, folks, no amount of free bananas is going to compensate for the fact that my boss is a bully and he isn't listening to me and I can't talk about how I'm feeling because actually I work in a culture where you shut up and put up. So really think carefully about the investment in those wellbeing initiatives. Otherwise, it's a bit like hanging a fancy mirror in a house that's built on sand. If the foundations aren't there, the fancy mirror won't really make a difference in the fullness of time. Creating that organisational climate is so important, especially when we look at today's topic around mental health and well-being. And I use the analogy of it being like a little fishbowl, making sure that the temperature's right. Is it warm? Is it friendly? Is it an inviting environment to be in? Is the water clear? Do people have clarity? Do they know what's expected of them? Do they understand what good looks like? Do they have managers that regularly review performance and redirect where necessary? Is the environment stimulating? Do people have choice? Do people have variety? Are people engaged? Do people get to contribute? Do their opinions matter? Do people feel as though they belong or are indeed their little exclusive groups, shall we say? Belonging is a basic human need, and any of you that have done any work around human psychology will know that it's as important to us as food and water and shelter. We need to feel as though we belong. We need to feel safe. And health and safety isn't just about hard hats and high vis. It's also about psychological safety. Are we creating an environment where it's okay to be me, where it's okay to talk openly and honestly, and where my needs are indeed met? And if you use the analogy of that little goldfish bowl, if somebody does go off sick, so let's say we have to remove one of our little fishes and we need to keep it safe and we need to tend to its illness or its disorder or whatever it is that's impacting that little fish, and we fix it and we give it time away and we give it medication, just as if someone was off sick. If you then bring back your little fish into a climate, into a culture that's still toxic, chances are your little fish will be getting sick again quite soon. So really think about organisational climate and the difference that makes, and how we as employers and organisations and managers and leaders and HR professionals absolutely have a duty of care in that regard. And again, that's where the Really Useful Conversations podcast comes in. In recent episodes, we've talked about homophobia in the workplace. We've talked about menopause in the workplace. We've talked about suicide ideation. We've talked about how to have conversations about mental health. And we'll continue to do that because it is so important that we can get comfortable with the uncomfortable, talk about things that matter, and create that ideal environment where people do feel valued, where people do feel it's safe to be themselves, and therefore engage fully in the work that they're required to do. Those strong foundations really do make a difference. And, installing a new bike shed, or making sure that people get the opportunity for, I don't know, a on-site massage. All of that stuff's lovely, don't get me wrong, and it absolutely can contribute positively to mental well-being. But again, if we're using that rather than building strong foundations with the culture and climate of our business, they may be nice to haves, but will they really make a difference to the person who's having thoughts of suicide because of work-related stress? I think not. But what if you've already got somebody who is struggling? It's all very well and good to highlight your duty of care in preventing and protecting from poor mental health. But what if you've got somebody that needs support? What can you do without becoming their counsellor, their therapist, their problem solver? And so you'll see there on the screen a list of ideas, list of things to think about, and just make sure that within your organisation, you are doing everything you can to support mental health in our unequal world. Because if 6 out of every 10 people are not able to access the treatment they need when they need it, that absolutely is going to have an impact for you. Even just in terms of absenteeism, we know that the average absence for a mental health disorder is typically 24 days, which is significantly more than the average absence for something like tonsillitis. So it really is in the business's best interest to be investing in this area. The consulting firm Deloitte have actually demonstrated through research that for every £1 invested in mental health, the organisation can anticipate a £5 return. So £1 investment for a £5 return, that's not bad odds. And we can make sure that we are investing by creating the culture that I've spoken about, by encouraging dialogue between people and between colleagues. I run a workshop called Are You All Right, Mate? And organisations have used that to encourage colleagues to have peer-to-peer conversations about mental health and well-being. Because some people may not feel comfortable to talk to their boss. They might feel more comfortable to talk to a colleague, a co-worker, a member of their team. So things like that, initiatives like that, that really do get the conversation started. And clearly we need to make sure we've trained our managers to have conversations that matter, conversations that they can have confidently in a timely fashion. Conversations that sit within the policies that your organisation has, because you could have the very best policy in the whole wide world, but if you've not got managers capable of conducting themselves appropriately within those policies, where does that leave us? We also need to educate and encourage people around self-care. As I'll go on to suggest, well-being happens when the individuals are taking responsibility for themselves, when the organisation is providing a culture and support that's needed, and where line managers, the single biggest influence, are interacting with their team in a way that creates trust and that feeling of support. But individuals do have a responsibility for themselves. So as an organisation, how much are you educating around that? I mentioned earlier the free resources that's available on the Confident Conversations website. There's a resource on there that talks specifically about self-care, and that might be something that's useful for you to download and perhaps share with your team, so that we can actively encourage people to take care of themselves. As an organisation, it might be that you'll look at having a decent occupational health provider or an employee assistance programme. I know lots of my clients have recently invested in an EAP, which basically, if you're not familiar, is often a 24-hour confidential helpline that people can phone and get help with emotional or psychological issues, but also with practical issues, finances, debt, legal matters. And we know that EAPs can make a world of difference. One of my clients that I was working with, their employees and their family were able to access services that if I was having to pay for it privately, I'd be looking at £60 to £100 an hour as a cost. And if I was in a queue on the NHS, I'd potentially be waiting up to 9 months to access. So EAPs can be a good way of helping your workforce stay healthy and well, and facilitate a quicker return to the workplace. But even if we don't have such systems in place, knowing where to signpost people is an important factor. And signposting to organisations such as Samaritans, such as Mind, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of organisations, voluntary organisations, charitable organisations, professionals who can help people with all sorts of challenges. I did some work recently with the Salford Citizens Advice Bureau, and those guys, they can offer a whole range of advice and support to people. You know, we're not talking here about mental health only being caused by emotional or psychological distress. People can find their mental health being negatively impacted by debt, by divorce, by bereavement. So please do know where to signpost your people if they do need that support from an external resource. And again, really useful resources. That PDF's available to download from my website. That will give you a really good place to start. You might look at developing champions within your business. I run a program called First Aid for Mental Health, which is not about encouraging people to be counsellors or therapists or give them a status that means they have to be available to people at 3 o'clock in the morning. Far from it. It's about, as an organisation, you having people in place that can create an opportunity for supportive dialogue and that know where to signpost somebody if they are indeed in distress. And so things like having those champions that really points out to your business that you are indeed serious about supporting well-being. You might also think about any reasonable adjustments that you need to make. Employers are often very familiar with reasonable adjustments where we've got physical ailments, but when it comes to mental health conditions, just how good are we at those reasonable adjustments? And if you've got somebody who's returning from sick leave and they've been off sick because of a mental health disorder, would you know how to go about making those adjustments to facilitate that return safely? And that then forms part of what we call a WRAP. Wellbeing Return Action Plans. Many of you will have absence management policies that talk about doing a return to work interview with employees. And we would add a little step to that when it comes to supporting mental health in our unequal world by making sure that a WRAP is in place so that that person does indeed get the help and support they need. I would suggest the last thing that any decent employer would want would be to be referenced in a coroner's report if the worst were to happen. So getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, encouraging conversations that matter, all of that will help us to change attitudes because we know there is still a stigma around mental health. Despite all the work that's been done in recent times, last year in the UK, we still had 300,000 people referred to services. We had 6,500 people die by suicide. So even though attitudes are changing, we are certainly not where we need to be yet. And therefore, a little bit of work around that within your business can absolutely make that difference. But recognising, please, as I said before, that the organisation isn't solely responsible for your individual's health and well-being. They too have a responsibility to themselves. And so if you can get that combination of educating and raising awareness, as an organisation, having the right policies, having the right culture, having the right people, and training and educating line managers so that they can create a psychologically safe environment where, like the little fishes, people can look forward to coming to work, to being engaged and to performing at their highest level. It really is a responsibility that should be shared by all three. But as an organisation, there's a lot that you can be doing to encourage that. And education is a really good place to start, both with individuals and line managers. So folks, I'm hoping that this is giving you some food for thought. It's so important that as far as mental health in our unequal world goes, we recognise that we do have a responsibility. We do have a duty of care. whether it's about preventing issues from arising in the first place by making sure that we are indeed behaving, managing, leading appropriately, or whether it's about recognizing if people are struggling in distress, even having thoughts of suicide, that as an organization, we are well equipped to support those people. It makes sense from a business perspective, not just legally or morally, but also financially. And again, the research from Deloitte makes that very clear. So recognizing that we want to be able to support people, we want to behave like decent human beings, we want to be an employer with a good reputation. How do we do that without becoming counsellors or therapists? And if anybody is interested in doing any of that work and you want to chat to me about it, there's a whole range of stuff that we can do to help you on that journey to creating that culture. Whether it's simply by giving your employees a link to the Really Useful Conversations podcast that encourages awareness, whether you want to do some lunch and learn seminars where we just do a quick hour of awareness and education, or whether you want to do some training events with your managers, with your leadership population. Please do get in touch if you are keen to be one of those employers of choice. And let's have a really useful conversation about what we can do that's practical, that's down to earth, that will make a difference to the narrative. I'm not talking candles and sandals. It doesn't have to be that way. 7 significant conversations that we need to be having in today's organisations. If we recognise that the system we are relying on for people to get help is indeed underfunded, overstretched, overwhelmed, it makes it even more important that if we do want to keep our people safe and well, if we do want to support them and have them as valued employees, that we are absolutely capable of having conversations that matter. And I would urge you to have a little think about that, and to have a think about whether these conversations do happen consistently and well within your business. And if not, what you could choose to do about it. As I say, prevention is always better than cure. But sometimes if you've got people who are being affected by their life outside the workplace, you've got people who are perhaps struggling with a mental illness, what do you need to do as an employer so that you are doing the right thing and the best thing for your people and for your business? And I hope my little presentation this morning has given you some things to think about. And if anybody has got any questions that you'd now like to ask, I am more than happy to answer those questions, assuming I can. But I'll just turn off the recording now so that we can deal with any questions confidentially. Just bear with me a second.